Hi, so my name's Finn Brunton. I'm an assistant professor at NYU. I live at finb.net. That's also where you can email me. I wrote a book about the history of spam, which, you're hardly encouraged to buy, but I just learned that another copy has been uploaded to LibGen if you want to go there instead. And I am super nervous. I'm currently working on a book about obfuscation with Helen Nissenbaum. If you saw Daniel Howe's talk, it touched a little bit on some of those things. And I'm researching a book about digital cash and cryptocurrencies. And I'm a huge money nerd, and this is proof. This is me posing at the site of the Bretton Woods Monetary Conference. We actually had a bunch of pictures inside the hotel, but they kicked us out after a while. If you go on tour to find places where major money policy events happened, I think that kind of qualifies you for nerd cred. And Hope is pretty much the best conference that I attend. And I understand how brutally high the opportunity cost is for choosing one thing over another. So I really appreciate you giving me an hour of your precious Hope time. And so what can you get from this talk for your hour of attention, especially given that you all have been primed for world historical significance, the Ellsberg Snowden thing, and then we took a deep dive into what I'm about to do. So just brace yourselves. What I want to give you over the course of the next 45 minutes or so are some big ideas and the room to use them for the project of transforming money technologically as a way of transforming society for the better. And my sort of bona fides for that is that I'm actually mostly a historian. I work on the history of science, technology, especially things like digital computation, which is part of why I love being here, because this place is a living tradition. This is a place that goes straight back to the dawn of what we can think of as kind of the 20th century radical use of technologies, which is it's very exciting to be here and talk about the future. And what I want to suggest is that money is something that you can and should hack on. I want to say, to sort of paraphrase Ted Nelson, you can and must understand money now. And I want to suggest that we do this not just by making contributions to altcoin development or pitching in on building better exchanges, although those are both good things, very useful and valuable. I'm going to talk about what I really mean by changing money, by hacking on money, in a second. Now, I want to also have one quick preface here, which is that I had this kind of initial impulse. I was really nervous because this is Hope. This is the best audience basically ever. So I thought I would give this totally responsible talk that was full of careful points of historical reference. A friend of mine said, your slides are always really boring. You should start to jazz them up a little bit. So I decided that for all the things that were said in the 80s, it would kind of look like that. 80s through the mid 90s, it looked like two analog synthesizers fucking in front of a Nagel print or something. I just love that nice gradient. Anyway, I was going to give this really responsible talk that was going to kind of build on historical precedent and talk about R&D and cash cards and electronic purses in the 1990s. You're welcome to come up and talk to me about that afterwards if you'd like. It's an amazing area of history. It's incredibly understudied. And early Hashcash style systems and lessons learned and all that sort of thing. But then I realized this is Hope. So instead I'm just going to rant and be completely irresponsible and hope that no one that I work with is watching the live stream. And part of what I would like to do is forecast some future stuff a little bit. And obviously, telling the truth and telling the future are very different things. So I'm going to tell you a story about a place that I think the future can go, about a way that I think we can fork history in a positive direction with the kinds of technologies that we have available. So let's start this off with a very big bet. I bet that the next century plus is going to have a recurring theme, and that recurring theme is going to be infrastructural struggles for autonomy. Infrastructural. These events will have profound consequences, but they will play out at levels well below the visibility of a war or an insurgency or an election. They will be contested and fought in the kind of domains that you think of when you think of, I'm going to move this so I'm not constantly wandering away from the damn microphone. There we go. Okay, very nice, yeah. When I'm up here and nervous, I didn't realize that it kind of sounded like a really bad cell phone call, quieter, louder. So So, infrastructural struggles for autonomy. Infrastructural. This means these struggles are going to be played out in the places that you think when you think of phrases, words like standards, architectures, gateway, spectrum, interoperation, airspace, routes, borders, protocols, logistics, regulations, chips, licensing, algorithm, identification and authentication, property, things like that. And they will be struggles. These will play out anywhere on the spectrum between disputes and war. The world will always be stricken, thank you, Getty Images, looping, GIF, which I didn't pay for. And yes, I pronounce it GIF, fucking come at me, I don't care. These struggles will play out anywhere in the spectrum between disputes and war, because the world will always be stricken with thugs, bullies, and tyrants, and the quislings, enforcers, and functionaries who do their bidding. But now their loathsome work will be taking place in the amazing technologies that we are starting to live with and helping to build here, just as it always has in the exclusion zones, the slave ships, the star chambers, the supermax prisons, and the cabinets noirs. They always have throughout history, and we need to oppose them with the same level of energy and inventiveness that we have always brought to the table. And finally, autonomy. These struggles will be over many domains, but I believe that likely and encompassing concern will be autonomy, self-governance, horizontality, decentralized and distributed systems, processes, and people, things that can be disarticulated from one of the handful of major global historical dynamics of the last 3.5 centuries, which is the steady, escalating ratchet of consolidation and centralized control. We're right on the front lines at Hope of a number of early forms of these infrastructural struggles, and we've heard many fascinating talks about versions of them over the last 2 days. They're only going to get bigger and crazier and more consequential, these battles, and yet they're going to get more invisible, harder to see, and therefore more urgently requiring our explanation and advocacy as well as technical additions from here on out. And I believe that money will be one of the 5 or 6 primary theaters in which this 21st century struggle is going to happen. So what the hell is money? Money is a puzzle, first and foremost. There are fossils in the beautiful limestone of the Piacenza Mountains in Italy. The shells of creatures from teeming Mesozoic seas interred in the bare rocks of the highest peaks of the mountain range. How did they come, asked Leonardo da Vinci, to be up so high? There are cowrie shells, huge piles of cowrie shells, in the arid regions of West Africa, thousands of miles from the Indian Ocean where the sea snails lived. We can ask with da Vinci, are we to believe that the flood reached so far? Of course, the cowrie shells, which appear here in a radical from ancient Chinese, which gradually transforms into the current classical Chinese symbol for money. These fossils, these cowrie shells, cowrie shells, are removed by a force even more powerful in some ways than geology, the force of trade, of things being tokened as money. To be more exact, cowrie shells were one of the things that oiled the operation of the terrible machine of the West African slave trade. So if cowrie shells can be money, then where do we draw the line? Where does it end? This is the great Martin Schubeck, and I love this because this seems like a classic kind of like trippy 90s, like high theory, abstract thing, you know? There is no basis, money is whatever, but Schubeck is not some kind of trippy guy. Schubeck is the guy who wrote Theory of Money and Financial Institutions. He's one of the great monetary theorists of the 20th century. He's a game theory dude. He's actually really into computers. And this was the best he could do. And I think this is very accurate. And the rules of the game are really complicated, and who gets to make those rules is enormously important. Because let's get back to cowrie shells. Once you'd actually use them in trade, it's not like you could actually do anything with them aside from make jewelry. But as it turns out, jewelry really matters. Jewelry does social signaling. It signifies prestige. Sharing it or giving it or demanding it cements bonds and relationships and alliances, and it knits groups together. Jewelry is a high bandwidth communication system. And maybe we can think of cowrie shell jewelry as being kind of like a terrific Google query ranking. I mean, modulo all the various problems with Google query rankings. But when you Google something, the first thing that comes up, that's a powerful symbol. That's who comes first. That's what really matters. That's the most important thing for the vast majority of people who only look at the first 3 results. And now, cowrie shells are kind of like that. You see who has the most. When you go into a space, you know who you need to talk to, you know who you need to ask favors of, except these are also, unlike many Google search query rankings, these are negotiable. These are liquid. You can give them to your friends and your cronies. You can move influence and power around. You can do business from the Maldives to Timbuktu to the trade bazaars of Western China. And of course, that means that these are also about moving power around. Notice all of these words like status and prestige, and of course, slaves. The property of moneyness is shaped by the rules of the game, and making the rules of money lets you restructure society itself at a very fundamental level. The rules of money can help to enforce and build on existing social and political structures, or they can undermine them, and we can see these powers with extra clarity when we see whatever passes for conventional money run low or run out. Ta-da! So take the Knights Hospitallers, the Knights of Malta, who'd received the privilege of mintage, the right to strike coin to function as tender. And we'll come back to that privilege and how you get it and what it means. In the 1530s, they were put under siege by the Ottoman Empire. This is a depiction of them on their island. I really like, for cartography geeks out there, I really like how this projection works to sort of gang everything together. They were under siege by the Ottoman Empire. It was an extraordinarily brutal siege, even by early modern standards. People shot the decapitated heads of Turks out of cannons. The Turks put dead people on crucifixes and floated them out to sea. The knights had torched all the crops before they retreated into the fortress. They poisoned all the wells. And then the Turks left. The siege broke. Now, the knights had a problem because they were sitting on a rock with completely annihilated cities and towns and shattered fortresses and almost no access to resources and wells that they had filled with a mix, and this is one of my favorite little details, of dead animals, hemp, fungally diseased wheat, and arsenic to make sure that the Turks couldn't successfully extract water from it. They were in the, I know, yum, yum. Yes, yeah. Yeah, well, Club Mate also has, you know, God knows, taurine and nicotine in there somewhere. Yeah, yes. So they were in this disaster zone, and they knew that the Ottomans were actually coming back. They had very, very little in the way of money. They'd run out of bullion, out of the precious metals that they could mint coins from. You'd think, being sacred knights with the backing of the Pope, they could just order people around, but even in the early modern period, there was no dice. So they did something kind of incredible. They took their privilege to make money, and they started striking these coins made of copper with the device of a handshake and the insignia that you can see around the rim there, non eas sed fides, not the copper or not the metal, but the trust. These coins are traded on trust. That's sort of what they do. You'll notice also the date is way later. They kept issuing these coins for a long time. This is just the highest resolution image I could find of one. This issue, these coins, came with a promise that the coinage could be redeemed in silver once the knights were back on their feet. So they would buy with the coins and the value of silver to get the stuff they needed to rebuild the cities and the fortresses and get the cannons and all the rest of it. And then eventually you'd be able to redeem it once everything worked out. And it worked. You can rebuild a whole city on trust if you have enough trust. Of course, it helps to be legendary religious war heroes and have your own island, but still, it's a starting point. Or take the Irish banking strike, moving closer to the present day, of 1970. The banks went on strike on the 1st of May, and they didn't reopen until mid-November. So think about this. All the banks close. You can't deposit checks. You can't get money out. No one can do anything financial. This is the era before ATMs, but even so, the ATMs wouldn't have been restocked after a limited period in any case. There was some advance warning, so people had some time to stockpile cash. But within a few weeks, the supply had already begun to run low. Employers were cutting deals with retail stores and churches to get their hands on enough ready, because churches have like tithing and poor boxes, and they have a lot of cash around. So to get enough ready money to pay wages. And as I'm sure you know, things shortly afterwards collapsed into lawlessness with roving gangs of new wave cannibals and post-apocalyptic thunderdomes. Or not, actually. Yeah, that's basically accurate. This is just outside of Dublin. Admittedly, but bearing in mind the money issue, because instead, people started using their checkbooks. They'd write checks for what they needed, and within smaller communities, the checks themselves started to become a kind of negotiable paper backed by the social graph. Individuals, families, and businesses all kept their own ledgers. These are the checks I'm holding from others, so that's kind of roughly what I have to work with, and these are the checks I have out to everyone else. In less tight-knit environments, like neighborhoods and cities, the reservoir of trust became the local pub. If someone was trying to float a substantial check, you'd go in and ask the bartender at their local whether they were an acceptable credit risk. The person who's chronicled most of this economic history phrased it this way. I love it when economists make jokes. Because bartenders could be trusted in a way that might be very difficult for other kinds of backing. As the blank checks started to run out, people began to make their own wonderfully elaborate IOUs with their banking information on it, countersigned by neighbors and friends and relatives. The strike did eventually end, of course, and it took the banks months to reconcile the intricate layers of transactions, because you couldn't just go through all the checks in one person's hands, because then they were leaning on other people's checks. There was this whole house of cards. Person A had issued against person B, who issued against person C. But nonetheless, there was astonishingly little fraud, like shockingly little, much less than you would expect. Of course, this wasn't a blissful utopia of mutual aid and social credit. As you can imagine, if you had any need for imports or foreign exchange, you were pretty well screwed. And of course, all this did lean on the fact that the banks would, in fact, eventually reopen. But to an astonishing degree, this system of moving social credit around worked. Indeed, the economy actually grew a bit. So to oversimplify, within a few months, you were drawing assets that weren't backed by government-issued notes, but by the social resiliency and internal trust of a tight-knit community of which you were a part. A reputation economy, essentially. So we have tons of examples of things like this and related systems that you can buy into because they work for you and you believe in them. Money is a form of allegiance, and this is where we're going to start circling back to cryptocurrencies. So what do you have an allegiance to? Well, maybe it's the local economy of the colonies, and eventually the notes issued by the revolutionary government of the United States. These were printed by Benjamin Franklin. I love his little, if you see over there on the note on your right, the counterfeit is death in the kick-ass metal Gothic font there. But also notice the leaf print. I just want to point this, look at what an amazing badass Franklin could be. He had done these books for a British naturalist who had wandered around in America getting leaf prints, and Benjamin had figured out how to print the leaves against plaster, cast metal against that, and he soon realized, wait a second, these leaves are really easy for me to print. They're really hard for people to reproduce by hand if they're trying to engrave their own plates to counterfeit this money. He had discovered something like the PNP problem of stuff. He had found a way of using something that was easy to verify but very hard to fake. Anyway, Franklin was pretty amazing. But yeah, so maybe you have an allegiance to these new colonies and their weird half-assed system of money with leaves on it. Or maybe you have an allegiance to the Limerick Soviet, where you are actually being issued money in which you are being promised by the workers of Limerick. It only lasted for a few months. Or maybe you have an allegiance to the idea that human time is the only really valuable commodity, in which case you very likely held notes from Uzziah Warren's time store in Cincinnati in the 1820s. This was an incredible project, which really did attempt to denominate the value of everything in the time a skilled person would spend on it. So who's skilled, Warren debated for a while, and then he eventually settled on carpenters, which is why the benchmark for value here is hours a skilled carpenter can work and corn. Those are the major sort of modes of exchangeability. Or maybe it's the anarchist economics of Silvio Gesell, who wanted to build local demurrage currencies, which is to say currencies that actually lose value with time deliberately to put people who hold money on the same footing as people who hold things like food or crops or other things that can kind of rust or rot or go away. But I love this so much because this is the flip side of one of Gesell's Freigeld notes. This is money that has its own man page. This is money that has its own instructions for use and manifesto explaining why you should be using it, which is pretty awesome. And needless to say, because this is so wonderfully geeky, naturally there's a cryptocurrency version now too, Frycoin, with an incredibly elaborate system of related things. If there's a Frycoin person here, please come talk to me. I love you guys. You are so amazing. Or maybe, hell, let's look at something that doesn't even look like money as we recognize it. Maybe it's something like tally sticks, a physical database made out of wood that lets you keep track of who has rights to which cow on a particular alp. This is a Swiss set of tally sticks here, and like it says at the bottom, this really does keep track of 87 cows among 23 different people. The beauty of it is that you can actually make these out of wood, carve them in certain ways, split them so that it's impossible for someone to change theirs without changing the other, because otherwise you identify the difference. And don't necessarily laugh at this as a mechanism. The entire financial architecture of Britain for centuries was built on tally sticks issued by the Exchequer, made from the willows that grew by the Thames. They did big money with this stuff, you know, money you owed to the king, money the king owed to you, the barons gambling land away, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They don't get the prominence they deserve because when they decided to modernize their financial system, they burned them. Because, you know, who wants to have these embarrassing relics around? So they destroyed this beautiful wealth of financial history and also overheated the chimney and burned down Parliament, which didn't turn out. So to have a little Jason Scott interlude here, this is further proof, don't fucking throw things away. Don't needlessly destroy things you don't need to destroy. You can never tell when you're trying to, like, you know, scrub all those old hard drives that you might accidentally, like, degauss everything. Who knows? So this is all to say, money is a significant part of what Benedict Anderson, the great political theorist, called imagined communities, the way we feel that we belong in a deep sense to groups, countries, nations, peoples, whom we'll never entirely know, who may not even have territory or formal structure. Money is a way that we can sort of vote, that we can ally ourselves with things. But of course, we all do this. We all show which allegiances we have. Everyone in this room has probably done multiple transactions in United States Federal Reserve notes today. And those are based on trust, too. Both that we trust that the notes we're accepting and passing aren't counterfeit, and in a deeper sense, that the Federal Reserve will not print too much money at once, and thereby render what we hold valuable, or not less valuable, or even worthless. And this, of course, requires backing in multiple forms. This is a very brief interlude, but I couldn't resist. Confidence in money is so fascinating, because to mean that money is not easily counterfeited, they have to put an amazing amount of technological thought into the architecture of physical currency, ranging from reading systems, which no longer really serve this purpose because there's not a lot of value in the metal in coins, but back in the old days was designed so you couldn't trim the edges of the coins off with a very sharp knife to get the little fine filings of silver while still letting the coin keep its initial face value. So yeah, they had to widely implement this so they could really see when you were starting to scrape stuff away. Isaac Newton had people drawn and quartered for doing things like this. This used to be a way more barbaric field than it is now. The sheer amount of technology that goes into securing a single note is an absolutely extraordinary thing. And forget about like the thermoreactive inks and the security threads and all the rest of it. Let's talk about one of my personal favorite things, which I bet a number of you are familiar with because this is hope, which is when you look at a US 20, notice the little yellow 20s that are scattered around in a cloud on one corner of the bill, and then notice the O's in that cloud, which fall into an arrangement called the Urian constellation, which is the subject of a collective agreement among quite a lot of different currency issuing countries and central banks and mints, and also the people who work on the firmware for color photocopy machines, that something that has the Urian constellation in it will not let itself be scanned or photocopied. It will not generate a page as a result of that. It is identifiable. You should look into the patents for this because the patents are fascinating. They're very thoughtful. And this is kind of a real-world version of the William Gibson sci-fi idea of the ugliest T-shirt in the world, the T-shirt that exempts whoever is wearing it from being able to be digitally captured. But it goes even beyond that in other ways. There's really incredible research going on right now into trying to figure out, because it's not just the Urian constellation. There's fascinating work going into trying to figure out what it is that is in money that makes it so that things like Adobe Photoshop can recognize when you're attempting to scan a note in or make changes to banknotes from particular countries. People are trying to sort of break down precisely how that works. Yeah, the policing of images of notes, again, to maintain confidence in the currency is an extraordinary project. You have to write to this dude in order to get high-resolution images of banknotes that you can do things with. You have to make a case to this guy and send a letter to his office, which is just delightful to me. But then there's the question, of course, of long-term value, and we're going to circle back to that in a second. Not just the question of whether or not whatever you're holding is counterfeit or not, but the question of how valuable it's going to be in the long term. Let's stay with the question of trust, because talking about trust means talking about the privilege to mint and specify currency. And that's the second most important privilege of the sovereign or the sovereign nation. And that's part of why cryptocurrencies are so important. Because as it turns out, being able to specify currency and mint currency is a great way to get people to do what you want. Let's say you want to conquer the world. You need an army, and that army is going to have a lot of foreign mercenaries in it. And these foreign mercenaries are not going to be cool with some kind of magic social credit scheme where you have to go talk to a bartender and then look at someone's GitHub stats, and then you get a special coupon that lets you have 2 hours of carpentry. They want cash. They want cash that they can spend in their home countries. So now you have two problems. You need to get cash for them, and you need to make that cash good wherever they travel. So if you're Alexander the Great, who faced exactly these problems, you realize, or rather some very smart people who work for you realize, that each problem is actually the solution to the other problem. As the sovereign, you can order the issue of coin in silver as soldiers' wages. And then as your soldiers conquer, you can demand payment of taxes and ransoms and tributes in your currency. So you've created instant demand. Suddenly everyone would really like to get their hands on some so they can pay their taxes and not get killed. And of course, war is also a terrific source of slaves, which is what you need to work the silver mines in Macedonia and Thrace, and booty, like the hordes of bullion from the Persians. So soon you've got this insane proto-military industrial complex going, where the demand for soldiers' pay stokes the fires of a Moloch of enslaved miners and the expansion of the imperial tax base. It turns out to be like drinking seawater. The more you have, the more you need. Now, the thing is, as monstrous as this plan is, it can actually kind of work okay, but let's say it doesn't. Some battles fall through, the sun is in your eyes, you know, who gives a shit? Something goes wrong with your amazing plan, and you kind of need to make a lot more money. Ancient Rome is where we get the term money. Ancient Rome is actually where we get the term money from the Temple of Juno Moneta, which was the point of issue of the denarius. And it was probably one of the most densely populated cities in the world, to this day, in parts, little districts of it. Think of Lagos or Mumbai. And it was a near total consumption and service economy city, with a metropolitan culture obsessed with the trappings of lifestyle, with elite goods and sumptuary excess. And it had a restive population, which was not afraid of the occasional riot. So when things get a little rough, you kind of can pad out the trouble if you're in charge of making the currency by adding some extra copper to the bullion. You need to pay more troops and keep the flows of grain moving into the capital, so then you add some more. And slowly over time, the money becomes less and less valuable in trade. All kinds of problems begin to appear. And this problem, this crisis, is massively increased by the transition to heavily leveraged paper money. That's Gutenberg freaking out from a cartoon in 1921 as huge amounts of money pour out of a printing press.